The Fisherman, 2537 Ireland and Revolution. Although I can see him still, the freckled man who goes to a grey place on a hill in grey Connemara clothes at dawn to cast his flies. It's long since I began to call up to the eyes this wise and simple man. All day I'd looked in the face what I had hoped would be to write for my own race and the reality. The living men that I hate, the dead man that I loved, the craven man in his seat, the insolent unreproved and no knave brought to book, who was won a drunken cheer, the witty man in his joke aimed at the commonest ear, the clever man who cries the catch cries of the clown, the beating down of the wise and great art beaten down. Maybe a 12 months since, suddenly I began, in scorn of this audience, imagining a man and his sun-freckled face and grey Connemara cloth climbing up to a place where stone is dark under froth, and the downturn of his wrist when the flies drop in the stream. A man who does not exist, a man who is but a dream, and cried, before I am old, I shall have written him one poem maybe as cold and passionate as the dawn. This poem is of interest to us, of course, because it documents Yeats's estrangement from the Irish middle classes, the estrangement that we saw him pay testament to in the first verse of Easter 1916. But it's a remarkable poem because, again, we can situate it in Yeats's conversation, not just with Irish politics and the Irish people and Irish art, but also degeneration theory. That point that he made in J.M. Singh and the Ireland of his times about fixation and how Ireland's fixation with nationalism and English hatred or hatred of the English produced a morbid persistence of minds unsettled by some fixed idea. We saw in the last lecture how Max Nordau had convicted the degenerate of fugitive ideation. But there was also this notion of the fixed idea was at the heart of degeneration theory. And we're going to have a look at Max Nordau contrasting Goethe to Schopenhauer. The point he's trying to make is that it's very difficult to tell a degenerate from a good artist, from a good degenerate artist. So he attempts a distinction. If Goethe had never written a line of verse, he would all the same have still remained a man of the world, of good principles, a fine art connoisseur, a judicious collector, a keen observer of nature. Let us, on the contrary, imagine a Schopenhauer who had written no astounding books, and we should have before us only a repulsive lusus naturae, whose morals would necessarily exclude him from all respectable society, and whose fixed idea that he was a victim of persecution would point him out as a subject for a madhouse. The lack of harmony, the absence of balance, the singular incapacity of usefully applying or deriving satisfaction from their own special faculty among highly gifted degenerates strikes every healthy censor who does not allow himself to be prejudiced by the noisy admiration of critics, themselves degenerates, and will always prevent his mistaking the mattoid for the same exceptional man who opens out new paths for humanity and leads it to higher developments. I do not share Lombroso's opinion that highly gifted degenerates are an active force in the progress of mankind. They corrupt and delude. They do, alas, frequently exercise a deep influence, but this is always a baneful one. It may not be at once remarked, but it will reveal itself subsequently. If contemporaries do not recognize it, the historian of morals will point it out a posteriori. They likewise are leading men along the paths they themselves have found to new goals. But these goals are abysses or waste places. They are guides to swamps like will-o'-the-wisps, or to ruin like the rat-catcher of Hamelin. Observers lay stress on their unnatural sterility. They are, says Tarabeau, cranks, wrong-headed, unbalanced, incapable creatures, They belong to the class of whom it may not be said that they have no mind, but whose mind produces nothing. And these, you recall, are people like Paul Verlaine and the symbolist poets. And here, of course, we could include among the symbolist poets Yeats himself. For his early works of the phase that we might call the phase of the Celtic twilight, the phase of his Celticism and his mythological folklore, the early poetry that we've been studying, is another example of symbolism and of, perhaps, what Nordau would call fugitive ideation. After all, what was the rose a symbol of in the poems that we studied? How could you account for its meaning? Well, Yeats was in conversation with degeneration theory as an aesthetic principle, and he himself was noticing or cultivating a more austere and concrete style than the style of his own early symbolism. And he may have been doing it in part in conversation with Nordau on this prospect of fugitive ideation. He was certainly doing it in conversation with Irish nationalism and Irish national politics and nationalist art. You see how the morbid preoccupation with the fixed idea he suggested in that essay is brought up here in terms of Schopenhauer's fixed idea of persecution. So again, degeneration theory is at one and the same time symptomatized by fugitive ideation, but characterized by fixed ideas. It's a rather incoherent discourse all along, and everywhere you put your finger into it, you discover an inconsistency, the problem of fixity versus flux. But in 1912, Yeats had committed to his diary a new statement of his aesthetic principles. And you'll see that it's vastly different from his earlier symbolism. The difference is charted usefully by Ellman in Yeats' The Man in the Masks. In a diary note dated Christmas 1912, he stated succinctly his present theory of art. First principles: not to find one's art by the analysis of language or amid the circumstances of dreams, but to live a passionate life and to express the emotions that finds one thus in simple, rhythmical language. The words should be the swift, natural words that suggest the circumstances out of which they rose. To see how far he had come, we may set this against the manifesto he had made 13 years before in an essay called The Autumn of the Flesh. It is almost, says Ellman, the exact contrary. I see indeed in the arts of every country those faint lights and faint colours and faint outlines and faint energies which many call the decadence, and which I, because I believe that art lies dreaming of things to come, prefer to call the autumn of the flesh. This exactly is what Max Nordau would decry as fugitive ideation, the moody poetry of the symbolists. But now Yeats is seeing himself as a poet of the concrete images suggested by concrete ideation and expressed in concrete language. And that's where we get a poem like The Fisherman, which is extraordinary, amongst other things, for the tightness of its form and the clarity and concrete nature of its language. And this is the new kind of poetry that Yeats congratulated himself on having discovered in around 1912, in contradistinction to his earlier symbolist phase. Okay, so we'll go back to The Fisherman now and have another look at the poem. Because this is a poem in which Yeats admits to deliberately cultivating a fantasy audience for his work. A man who does not exist, a man who is but a dream. So the subject of the poetry is more concrete, but the audience for the poetry is subjective or fantasy. And Yeats is beginning to actively and unabashedly fetishize the Irish peasant as part of his argument with the Irish middle class. And in this poem, he gives us a very brief, condensed statement of his impatience with their boorishness, their ignorance, their insolence, their cravenness, their ignorant jokes and their drunken cheer, and also their ignorance of art, the beating down of the wise, and great art beaten down. And he says it was about 12 months Maybe 12 months since that suddenly I began in scorn of this audience imagining a man and his sun-freckled face and grey Connemara cloth. And here you'll see the two images that will return in the Easter 1916 poem of the stone and the stream, climbing up to a place where stone is dark under froth, and the downturn of his wrist when the flies drop in the stream. It shows you that Yeats's poetic universe was gaining a kind of internal consistency. He had found the object around which to organize it, and that was his indignation at the common people of Ireland, the plain people of Ireland. And these were the people whom he contrasted to a kind of imaginary Irish peasant, an idealized version of a kind of pre-modern figure of integrity, a hunter-gatherer figure fishing for food, not fumbling in the greasy till. So that The Fisherman is a great poem to study for a number of reasons. Look at the tightness of the form, the extraordinary control of the simplest of images. There's nothing here to complicate, no red rose bordered hem, none of the obscure symbolism of the early works. It's a concrete evocation of reality, and it's done in a form that is notable for its muscularity. Yeats began to think of form in terms of prowess, that it was manly to control your medium and feminine along the lines of Matthew Arnold's analysis of the Celt, to just let lines flow. It's a masterful poem, The Fisherman, in which we begin to see Yeats turning away from the Irish people, indicting them for their boorishness, until in 1916, with the 1916 Rising, he's outmaneuvered again, and the very people he's indicting do something extraordinary, which changes Irish history forever.